Back during my childhood, I lived in a neighborhood that had a bunch of kids who were close to my age. We all lived on the same city block, and it was an ideal situation for us after school. We would all get together and play some sort of game outside. Oftentimes, the games would include things like wiffle ball, football, some sort of tag, or trampoline games. One day after school, the 6 of us who were outside that day decided to play sardines. The game sardines is basically like hide and seek, except only one person hides, and then the rest of the group has to split up to try to find them, joining them in their hiding spot once they find them. I ended up being the one who got to hide first. As a group, we had decided to make the game more fun by expanding the boundaries of where I could hide. Normally, we would only play on our city block, but we expanded it to include the next block over also. Once the rules had been debated and made clear, I was given 3 minutes to hide. I sprinted off towards the neighboring block looking for a good place. I ended up deciding on hiding in the driveway of a yard that had a lot of low-hanging trees growing in it. I found a good spot behind the trash can near the alley that had branches hanging down and covering most of the trash can. I had only been hiding for a couple of minutes when I heard a soft voice behind me say, "Hey, what are you doing?" It was an older gentleman who was crouched over picking weeds in the garden about 30 feet behind me. Assuming the man would want me to leave his yard, I stood up and began to leave, apologizing and explaining that I was just playing hide and seek with some friends. However, the man did not seem too upset. He actually told me that I wasn't in a very good hiding spot and that I could come into his yard and hide behind the big bush closer to his house. I was a very competitive kid and wanted to stay hidden as long as possible, so I agreed. I quickly ran and squatted down behind the big bush in his yard before any of my friends that could be in the alley would have a chance to see me. Instead of going back to picking weeds, the older man went into his house through the back door. Only a few moments later, he leaned out the back door and said that I should come into his house, and then I could watch my friends running by his kitchen window while I hid outside. I was pretty young, but I was old enough to know not to go into a stranger's house. The man kept urging me that it would be really funny to watch my friends not be able to find me from inside his house, and he didn't stop trying to persuade me. At this point, I was getting a little nervous, as his voice had risen in volume a little bit, and he wouldn't stop pestering me to come inside. I decided to get up and move back towards my hiding spot in his driveway, away from his house. When I got up to leave, he took a couple quick steps towards me while still telling me to come inside. Fully frightened now, I ditched the game of sardines and sprinted out of his yard back towards my friend's yard where we had originally began playing. It took a little bit to get all 6 of us back in the same area, and we ended up just playing some wiffle ball for the rest of the evening. I told my parents that night about the man's yard I was hiding in and how adamant he was of having me hide inside. My parents ended up banning me from going anywhere near that man's house again, as well as from playing the game sardines. I'm glad my parents educated me well when I was younger, and I was smart enough to know not to go into the strange man's house. Maybe the old man's intentions weren't bad, but it's still eerie how persistent he was on getting me to go inside his house. My husband and I had just moved into a new house. We had just moved in from out of state and had only been living there about a week. We had met a couple of the neighbors, but still didn't know anybody too well. One night, my husband was driving home late at night after picking up some fast food for us. Once he was inside, he told me that he swore he had seen somebody running away from the side of our house as he was pulling into the driveway. We decided to just make sure all the doors and windows were locked for the night, and we checked out the area by the side of the house in the morning. The next morning, we went to the side of the house to see. Nothing super noticeable was there, but my husband did notice one detail. There was a small, half-dead patch of grass under our bedroom window. The grass there was smushed and laying down, as if someone had been standing there. This led us to believe that someone had been standing right under our window, but they also would have been having to do it often, since the grass in that area was different. There was also the possibility that an animal like a rabbit enjoyed laying in that spot under our bedroom window, so we weren't entirely sure. That very same night, I woke up in the middle of the night to a soft clicking sound coming from outside our bedroom window. We had shades over the window, and they were closed, so I wasn't able to see anything unless I went over there and peeked through them. I quietly woke up my husband, and we sat in silence listening to the house. Finally, after a few minutes, my husband went over to the window and peeked through the blinds. The noise had stopped as soon as he had gotten out of bed, and he informed me that there was nothing there. This led us to conclude that whoever was out there could somehow see through some part of our blinds and leave the area before being seen. The very next night, we were both on edge already about the situation, and we woke up to the exact same clicking noise. Once again, my husband went to peek through the blinds to see nobody there. In our eyes, it was hard for us to imagine the problem being some sort of animal, and instead, we knew that we had what appeared to be a window creeper on our hands. We ended up moving out of that house within the next 2 weeks. We didn't think the area was a good fit for us, but the continued problem with the window creeper made our decision to move that much easier. For the rest of our time living in the house, we slept in the basement where there were no windows. As for the clicking noise that was under our window at night, we weren't sure. But assuming the worst, it might have been a creepy pervert who was either taking pictures of us with a camera somehow through the shades, or potentially it could have been something else. Either way, it was a disturbing couple of nights, and I'm glad that we ended up moving out. This happened to me many years ago in a neighborhood that I used to live in. I lived in a quiet neighborhood in this hilly area. It was a nice neighborhood to live in. There were a lot of winding roads with big houses and large yards as well. I'm guessing that a lot of the houses in the area were built by the same company because most of them were similar. The basement of the houses was actually on ground level, and the main floor and upper levels of the house were above that. All the houses had a big set of stairs attached, so to access the main floor, you wouldn't have to go through the basement area of your house. Due to the fact that the basements were ground level, many people had sliding doors in their basements that would lead out into the backyard. The reason for the in-depth description of the layout of the houses is because this is how my house was built. The last summer that I spent living in that neighborhood, there occurred a series of break-ins of people's houses, my house included. The night my house was broken into, I wasn't there at the time, but a couple of items were taken from my basement, including a bike that I kept down there. Later that summer, on one of my evening walks, I was shocked to see a younger man riding towards me on what appeared to be my bike. I figured this guy probably purchased my bike from the person who stole it, and I could get some sort of information on the culprit who was breaking into basements. I flagged down the guy on the bike as he approached, indicating that I wanted to talk to him. Upon me mentioning that the bike was mine, and I was interested in who he bought it from, the young man suddenly appeared very uncomfortable. Instantly, I realized this was perhaps the guy who had stolen my bike and broken into the basements throughout the neighborhood. Before he could begin pedaling away, I grabbed a firm hold of one of the handlebars to stop him from biking away from me. Further confirming my suspicion, the young man jumped off the bike and, to my surprise, pulled out some sort of small knife or switchblade. Full in fear now at the sudden escalation of the situation, I quickly hopped onto my bike and put some distance between us by biking down the street. The young man took a couple of steps towards me, as if he was going to chase me, but thought better of it and ran away. I biked home and notified the cops immediately of the young man and what he looked like. I alerted our neighborhood group chat about the young man and gave a brief description of him as well. The cops never ended up finding him or identifying who he was. Nobody in our neighborhood ended up seeing him again or having another basement broken into, but I was still nervous that I might run into the violent man again someday. It ended up being a frightful encounter on the street that day, but it was nice to get my bike back. A couple years back, my fiancé and I officially moved in together and got our first house. We were aware of the neighborhood we were moving to was not the greatest neighborhood, but our house was recently remodeled and it fit our budget. It became apparent to us within the first couple of weeks of living there that our neighbors were odd, to say the least. Sometimes we would see the owners out in the yard. The man and the woman who we would see often didn't seem very friendly. Whenever we tried starting a conversation, or even just some small talk with them, They spoke very quickly and did not advance the conversation in any way. They seemed intent on sticking to themselves and not making any signs of friendliness as neighbors often do. It wasn't the biggest deal in the world, but besides that, there was other odd stuff going on. Multiple times we would see tons of different cars in the driveway and different people coming either in or out of the neighbor's house. We never bothered to ask, but there was a lot of activity that would go on, as if they rented out parts of their house on Airbnb or something. One of those nights, while there were some more cars and people there that we had never seen before, something strange happened. In the evening, close to sunset, my fiancé and I were relaxing out on our back patio when a man who we had never seen before walked over to the fence between our yards. Surprisingly, he engaged in conversation with us. Normally, nobody from next door would even acknowledge it when we were outside, so it was odd to have somebody initiating a conversation. The conversation with this taller man was pretty normal at first. We were talking about how our day had been and the beautiful weather that we had had earlier that day. The man never mentioned anything about how he knew our neighbors or where he was from. Eventually, the quick conversation began coming to a close. The part which seemed a bit odd to us was that before leaving, he managed to mention multiple times how beautiful our house was and what a lovely couple we were. Later that night, we were drawn to our back window facing the backyard, and there was some light and noise out there. The same man we had talked to earlier was sitting in our chair in the backyard. He was on the patio and had started a fire in the fire pit. Totally shocked by the scene, we weren't sure if we should ignore him or see if he leaves at some point, or go out there and tell him to leave. I ended up opening the window and asking the man politely if he could put out the fire and go away. He responded by shouting up at the window that we should come down and sit with him. He wanted to get to know us better. We did not go out there and sit with him, and about 15 minutes later, he left on his own, putting out the fire. As the night went on, my fiancé and I began getting ready for bed. We had finished brushing our teeth when we heard a knock downstairs at the back door. We looked at each other in dread as we had a hunch who it would be. Sure enough, when we looked through the back window, the taller fellow was standing outside the back door, and he had a poker iron for the fire in one of his hands. His now crazy, anger-filled face stared up at us, shouting to come down and start a fire. Moments later, he began tearing our outer thin screen door apart with the broken iron. We called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man had left our back door and also drove away from our neighbor's house as one of the cars from their driveway was gone. The police ended up chatting with our neighbors once we explained the situation. The next morning, the man and woman who owned the house next door gave a quick apology for what happened, saying that it would never happen again, and then they ended the conversation very quickly and walked away as they often did. They paid for the fixing of our screen door, thankfully, though. Our neighbors kept having multiple different cars and people at their house, but we were never bothered again, and never again saw the tall man who had gotten angry with us. I live in a quiet neighborhood out in the suburbs. I enjoy going on walks around the neighborhood because there's a nice park area that goes in circles around a small pond, and there's a playground there as well. Most evenings, I would take a short walk through the neighborhood and around the pond. I would get my exercise in for the day, and it was relaxing to be out in nature. One Saturday during the summer, I couldn't take my walk until later because it had been raining all day. The rain finally stopped close to 10 p.m., and even though I don't usually take my walks in the dark, I thought it would be nice to get out of the house after being inside all day long. I began taking my normal route through the neighborhood and towards the playground, which would lead into the path and walk around the pond. As I approached the playground, I noticed there was a figure sitting there on the bench dressed in dark clothing. It was odd to see somebody out on the playground on this rainy night, but I thought it could be somebody like me getting out of the house for a bit. As I continued and began to enter the path that would lead around the pond, I was surprised to see the person from the playground had gotten up and was heading my way. It appeared that they were going to take the same path around the pond that I was taking, right behind me. I immediately felt uneasy, especially since the person was walking pretty fast. I was also nervous because the walk around the pond was very dark and there were no lights in that area. I was extremely nervous about having someone walk behind me in the dark for that entire walk. As soon as I entered the darkness of the path, I began to run, not a full sprint, but considerably quicker than a jog. My fears reached a new level at about halfway around the pond in the distance behind me when I heard footsteps pounding on the pavement. The person who had followed me onto the wooden path had also begun to run, and it sounded like they were gaining on me. With less than half of the walk left, I increased my run to a full-on sprint so that I could get back to the lighted area on the sidewalk by the main road. I managed to make it out of the dark wooded path before whoever was running behind me could catch up. I ran down the main street a bit back towards my house and kept looking back to see if somebody would exit the path from around the pond and come out into the lighted sidewalk. Nobody came out from the path. It appeared they had stopped and were staying in the dark area. I didn't see anybody the rest of my walk home, but just in case, I took a different way back than I normally do that involved more turns through the neighborhood. It seems that whoever had been chasing me wanted to catch me on the stretch of path around the pond where it was dark and wooded. I'm glad that I trusted my instincts and began running as soon as I entered the wooded path. Otherwise, the person might have caught up with me. That was the last walk that I ever took after dark around my neighborhood, and I was still skeptical taking that path around the pond, even during the day.